in the current set of like financial and economic situation, B2B companies now need to be profitable and efficient. It's no longer growth at all costs. Growth matters, percentage growth matters, but companies need to be delivering a combination of growth and profit, which is very different than how it was a couple of years ago. And when you listen to customers, what you find is a lot of the most effective things that you do in your go-to-market are also the things that cost the least amount of money. The big shift happened, what I call COVID-induced like changes into how people use the internet, where everyone went into remote work, and executives that are responsible for millions or tens of millions of dollars in budget that used to never use LinkedIn, that used to never come to a live event, that was not in part of a Slack community like Pavilion or CMO Coffee or any of those things, or my own live event. They didn't do any of those things in 2019. And then a couple of years later, they were trained about how to use all of those places to get information from their peers. And then they figured out that the information they get from their peers is the most trustworthy and valuable information that they can use in order to drive strategy, make purchasing decisions, decide what product to use.
All right. You guys are in for a treat today because today we have on here Chris Walker. He is the founder and CEO of Refine Labs, a B2B demand gen consultancy. He started in 2019 from his living room with one $100 an hour client contract. And then in less than 3 years, he grew that into an 8-figure revenue business with over 200 B2B companies that he's consulted for. He started the Revenue Vitals podcast, which is one of the premier podcasts for revenue leaders out there, oftentimes challenging the status quo of B2B go-to-market strategies. And what is he working on right now? He's the CEO of Pasetto, which is a tech-enabled go-to-market strategy consultancy where they use proprietary data models to help B2B executives identify and execute against their highest priority growth levers. We're going to break today's session down into 2 parts. Part 1 is talking about the modern go-to-market playbook, and part 2 is digging a bit deeper into signal-based go-to-market. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you on today.
Alan, pumped to be here, man. Looking forward to diving in.
All right. So the first question is, what makes you a revenue rebel? How do you do things differently? Should be an easy one for you.
Should be an easy one for me. Step 1, listen to what customers are actually doing. Listen to what they're doing. Ask them, see what places that they get information from and what source of information that they trust and how they want to buy products and what are the gaps in the market right now, and leverage all of that information that you get directly from your customers to form a unique differentiated strategy around what they actually want and be able to make it work for you as well. I think that's step 1. When you follow that step, what it leads you to is doing a lot of things in your go-to-market very differently than how a traditional company would do it. In the current set of like financial and economic situation, B2B companies now need to be profitable and efficient. It's no longer growth at all costs. Growth matters, percentage growth matters, but companies need to be delivering a combination of growth and profit, which is very different than how it was a couple of years ago. And when you listen to customers, what you find is a lot of the most effective things that you do in your go-to-market are also the things that cost the least amount of money, and at the same time require the most amount of expertise and the most amount of customer focus and the most amount of differentiated strategy. And so I think that thing is a big one. And then lastly, I entirely challenge and completely rethink the way that go-to-market measurement happens inside of B2B companies, which traditionally has been an assembly line between marketing and SDRs and solutions consultants and sales and account management, where people pass the baton between things and have intermediate metrics where marketing's responsible for MQLs or MQL to SQL conversion or meetings booked, and SDRs are responsible for another little micro part of the process, and then downstream sales just has to close all the stuff when all of the upstream processes are not aligned to revenue. I think that marketing attribution and how we think about go-to-market analytics is entirely flawed and leads executives to not have the right data to make what should be fast and easy decisions, and continue to challenge the way that we run our analytics inside of B2B companies, which fundamentally hasn't changed very much in the past decade. And I think at this point, the economic situation is forcing B2B companies to look more at transformational changes inside of their go-to-market rather than incremental improvements. And I think it's going to be good for the industry, good for individual contributors, good for leaders, good for investors, and good for customers.
I'm really excited to talk about how we're going to reshape marketing attribution. We'll get into this topic a little bit later. Coming back into the first point of smaller things that can make big impacts, one of the things I think that can make a huge impact is just choosing the right accounts. So how have you seen how we find the right accounts have changed over time?
back in the day, a lot of companies didn't even really target by account. They just looked for someone that had the job title, and they didn't really think a lot about best fit accounts. I remember in 2017, it's interesting, maybe it's because we were a verticalized company and we sold into hospitals, but inside of our Salesforce instance in 2017, we had every single hospital, every single account inside of our Salesforce. We knew how many beds the hospital had. We knew how many beds were in each department. We were able to use that data to understand what was the potential lifetime value of each account. And we tracked the data around each account in 2017. I think that was very innovative. And I learned a lot through that experience because I don't think many companies, especially B2B marketers, were thinking that way back in 2017. Now we have an enormous amount of data around companies and how many employees those companies have, and even what technology and technographics that they use, and the data available about the people that work there and their job titles and the org structures and things like that. I think that we've had this wave of go-to-market over the past 5 years, account-based marketing or account-based experience or whatever you want to call it, that was all revolving around targeting the right fit of accounts. I think that account-based marketing is largely misunderstood, thinking that it's only about finding the top 50 accounts and having an integrated sales and marketing motion to go after that. But in reality, it's looking at all of your total relevant market, tiering those accounts based on the potential lifetime value, and then having specific go-to-market motions to target each of those different tiers and segments based on the allowable cost of acquisition relative to the lifetime value of companies. And so I don't think account-based marketing or account-based experience is just about finding our top fit, highest value $1 million accounts and running display ads to them. I think it's a lot more thinking about our entire go-to-market in tiers and prioritizing those tiers of accounts.
Can we talk a little bit about how maybe the buying behavior has changed and the sales go-to-market motion has changed to revolve around that? What happened to the buying journey and how buyers make their decisions?
The core thing that's changed over the past 15 years in go-to-market, and yes, this change has been happening for a long period of time, is through the scale and the maturity of the internet and how B2B buyers are able to use that information in order to research, discover, purchase, and evaluate products. And so if you can remember, back in 2012, B2B companies barely invested in websites. Most companies weren't doing SEO or blogging. Most companies didn't have a digital strategy. Most companies didn't have an inside sales team. Most sales teams were outside sales, was then responsible for prospecting, closing, onboarding, expanding, and a full cycle sales rep back in the day. And because B2B buyers did not have information on the internet like review sites or access to information about pricing or access to their peers to ask questions in communities or through social networks or access to influencers, they had a very limited set of places where they could get information to make buying decisions, which were analyst firms. Maybe they would go to Google and find some information on the internet, and largely they would get information from a sales representative. And so those were the places where B2B buyers could, or they would go to a conference once a year and try and extract information either from booths or from thought leaders that would present at those conferences. And that was 12 years ago. And then over time, what's happened is that the internet has matured, social networks have developed, thought leaders can produce content not only at an event once a year, but produce content on the internet through social media networks or content or through webinars or places like that. And then the big shift happened, what I call COVID-induced like changes into how people use the internet, where everyone went into remote work, and executives that are responsible for millions or tens of millions of dollars in budget that used to never use LinkedIn, that used to never come to a live event, that was not in part of a Slack community like Pavilion or CMO Coffee or any of those things, or my own live event. They didn't do any of those things in 2019. And then a couple of years later, they were trained about how to use all of those all of those places to get information from their peers. And then they figured out that the information they get from their peers is the most trustworthy and valuable information that they can use in order to drive strategy, make purchasing decisions, decide what product to use, and things like that. And so because they were able to learn that, now they use very different sources of information in order to make purchasing decisions than they used to use. But B2B companies have not adjusted to this reality and continue to put content and invest a lot of money in places that B2B buyers typically trust the least. And so there's been a massive wave. Before, a sales representative would basically control 100% of the sales process because they were the guard of the information the buyer needed to make a decision. And the data right now is that a salesperson is involved in 5 or 6% of a buying decision, an individual's purchasing decision, which is entirely different than how the world used to work. And we need to adjust to that reality by putting information and content in the right places, by investing money in the places where our customers find to be the most trustworthy, to think fundamentally differently about how we run our go-to-market strategy.
Can you maybe talk through a couple examples of how revenue teams need to adapt to build that trust? What are some things that they can do?
A large amount of B2B go-to-market strategies revolve around, let's try to get a lead and then have our sales rep try to sell to somebody that doesn't want to buy right now, but works at the right company that we've decided is a good fit for us and has the right job title. And they use their most expensive resource in the entire company, their sales resources, to try to convince a person that doesn't want to buy, just like it was in 2012 when the information wasn't available. And now the buyer just is going to tune that stuff out because they can get information from a ton of different places. They don't need your sales rep tell those things. And so it creates massive inefficiencies, both in how companies spend money to generate a lead, and then having all of this human capital that's super low productivity trying to convince a lead that doesn't want to buy. And so the major adjustment is that we need to be focused on creating demand, being able to inform our target accounts through information and content, both our own as well as external trusted resources. Some might call that an analyst firm being in the magic quadrant, or using influencers or thought leaders and partnerships and other types of content collaboration to then guide people to want to buy, and then allow our sales reps to do what they do best, which is help our customer buy what they want to buy and evaluate the decision to make sure they're making a good decision, rather than having our sales rep try to convince people that don't want to buy. It creates much more balance in the overall go-to-market engine that didn't exist a long time ago, about how we need to think about marketing and the company largely about how we create demand, but marketing is responsible for a lot of that in most companies. That is a critical part of being able to generate revenue that wasn't the same 10 years ago. And I don't think that marketing measurement models or go-to-market strategies have adjusted to this reality fully.
Yeah, you talk about this a lot, this idea of demand creation and then demand capture. Maybe historically, a lot of marketing's time was spent on demand capture, but it seems like there's two pieces that come out of this. One is this burgeoning category of demand creation, which marketing spends more time on to create the brand, create the education, to make sure that people, one day when they're in the buying cycle, they'll come directly to you, and the demand capture is finding them at the right time and hitting them with the right message.
To be clear, marketing does not spend more time or money on demand creation today relative to 10 years ago, because of the flaws in the attribution models and the KPIs that companies use. So while it would make a lot of sense to do that, most companies do not. Our estimates with the budget data that we get analyzing a lot of companies is still more than 90% of the marketing budget is spent specifically to capture demand, not to expand accounts, not to convert active pipeline and accelerate sales velocity, and not to create demand. It's all based around generating a lead so sales can try to generate pipeline, is where a majority of the money and focus still goes today. And then there's just a large inefficiency in that process. So there's an overspending around demand capture, right? The estimate right now, somewhere between 1% and 5% of your total market is quote unquote in market to buy at any one time, depending on the maturity of the category. And all of this money is being spent to capture that 1% to 5%. And it just creates a massive inflation inside of the cost of acquisition and the overall productivity of reps.
Given all these things, what would you say the modern sales motion would look like? Where do we need to evolve into? Which part's human? Which part's automation? How is the space changing due to AI?
I think if companies rebuilt their models, historically it was a reverse sales headcount model. So on average, our rep is going to close $1.2 million in new business next year. So if we want to close $40 million, I guess we need 36 reps or whatever the math comes out to be. And that's how companies still budget and plan a lot today. And the problem is that the way that a buy or buy has fundamentally changed, where a sales rep is not going to go out and create that demand anymore. And so instead of thinking about how many reps do we need to hit that based on an average quota attainment, we need to think about how many accounts can we get in market to buy that our sales team can convert and close. So it's almost rethinking the entire model about how much demand can we create, which then drives us to how many resources that we should drive to capture that demand, rather than the other way around.
One of the issues with this that I see a lot, especially for our own company, is that when you raise a big round, you need predictable revenue stream to show that you're going to hit some sort of number. And to your point about marketing attribution, it's hard to figure out how much pipeline you would generate inputting this much amount of money into the marketing demand creation budget. So just curious how you think about that.
The funny thing about quote unquote predictable revenue is that it's predictably terrible ROI always. Sure, you might be able to understand how many MQLs you get, and you know you're going to convert those MQLs at 0.8% into a meeting, and you're going to win 10% of those into a customer. And in the growth at all costs era, that was fine because nobody cared how much it cost to acquire a customer. But now everyone needs to be focused on that. And when you look at the models, they just don't make financial sense and are not economically viable anymore. And so what companies have spent the past 10 years doing is incrementally improving this shitty model. How do we get our SDR connect rates to improve from 0.8% to 1%? How do we get our cost per lead from $150 to $140 next year? How do we get our sales team to win 16% of the deals from stage 2 instead of 14%? And the incremental improvements in this model at this point fundamentally do not solve the issue anymore. And so I think that B2B companies now need to be looking at transformational changes, how we think about rebuilding our entire revenue model, how we rebuild our entire go-to-market strategy, how we plan and budget and what the guardrails around those are, what KPIs that we measure, how we decide what's working and what's not. I think all those things should be under question, because if you just look at a majority of companies right now, there are a large set of what I would call a mid-market company, but specifically 100 to 300 million ARR company that used to be growing at 40%, that this year is planning to grow at 10 or 12%, that at the same time is going to burn $100 million this year. And so you're growing at 10%. Let's say you're a $200 million company, you burn $100 million, which is your negative 50% EBITDA. You have 10% growth. Instead of rule of 40, your rule of negative 40. And investors just simply do not value that anymore. And a lot of the stock that's in there is basically worthless, except for the investors that might be able to get a 1-to-1 back. And so I think, like in a lot of those companies, like I said, improving how your SDR connect rate isn't going to fix the fact that you need to find 80% in a combination of growth and EBITDA in the next couple of years so that you can not raise a massive down round or so that you can IPO. And we just need to be looking at entirely different changes. And I believe we'll see how it plays out. Like, people need to face reality. A lot of the companies in that segment are going to have to face reality because the growth rates are not strong enough and the profitability is so bad and they don't have enough runway to sustain, and they're not going to be able to IPO without a huge loss. And for all those reasons, like, I think that we're going to see a lot of companies have to make massive changes around how they invest in specifically in go-to-market, because it tends to be the largest expense on the P&L.
Can you go through some of the clear bad things, tactics that people are doing that don't return ROI, but is pretty commonplace actually, given all the companies that you've seen? Is it investing too much on SDRs? Is it putting too much on like marketing emails that say, do you want to buy? Do you want to buy? Do you want to buy? Where's all that budget going?
Entirely across the go-to-market. Number one, over-specialization of roles that happen. So before, a lot of companies 10 years ago would have an account executive or a territory manager that would be responsible for prospecting, closing, onboarding, making the customer successful, and expanding the customer. And now in a B2B tech company, you have an SDR, an AE, a solutions consultant, an onboarding manager, a CSM, and an account manager to do the same exact job. 6 people to do the same job that 1 or 2 people used to do 10 years ago. So over specialization of roles. Number 2 is the combination of the amount of money that companies spend in marketing to create signals, i.e. something that gives sales a reason to reach out. So marketing dollars get spent specifically on performance marketing, Google ads, content syndication, LinkedIn lead generation, getting lead lists or booth scans from events, things like that. And then the incredibly low productivity about following up on those types of things, where the conversion to a customer is going to be around 0.1%, which means that it takes 1,000 sales activities against 1,000 accounts or people to close one, to put an opportunity in pipeline that's going to close. And then when you operate that with 1 rep, maybe it's fine. But when you operate that with 100 reps or 100 reps and 50 SDRs or whatever your ratios are, the inefficiencies become entirely untenable. And what it leads to is it leads to bloated SDR teams. It leads to bloated sales teams that have very low quota attainment. It leads to tons of marketing dollars being spent in order to create signals that don't drive revenue. And across the entire go-to-market, it creates massive issues. And with the over-specialization of roles and the large bloated teams, what happens is it creates management layers and communication layers and reporting cadences and all this other overhead that happens at the management level that is entirely unproductive and wasteful as well. And so to me, this is a systemic problem across the entire business, specifically in go-to-market, but it affects the entire business. When you spend 50, 60% of revenue on sales and marketing and don't get the appropriate return, it impacts the entire business. It impacts how much you can spend on R&D. It impacts how much you can spend on culture and HR. It impacts how employees feel when you're missing your plan every quarter. It impacts how investors are going to handle the board meeting. It impacts how you're going to raise money in the future. It impacts how you can take care of customers. It's a systemic problem across the entire business that gets created through the overspending and irresponsible spending inside of the go-to-market team.
It's interesting. Like the more you try to grow, the less marginal return you have, and it starts to really plateau. The more bloat you have in the system, the less effective. And actually, seems like the buyer experience suffers even more because you have all these roles that need to communicate with each other. And the buyer experience is, I just want this thing right now. And that right now moment could be fleeting. It could be 8 seconds. It could be a minute. It could be 1 second. It could be gone. And so